All right, we're live. We're live. What's up, FOMO?
I'm live. I love
Yeah,
it.
how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you, buddy?
Oh, I'm doing well. We're gonna talk about something very interesting today, which is objective versus I don't know if it's versus, but subjective and objective reviews when it comes to
Right,
audio.
right.
You have done some audio reviews, especially recently with the Sony
Mm-hmm.
what is it, HT-A9.
Yes, I have.
So you know what that's like. You also do TV reviews as your main thing, right?
Yes, most
So
definitely.
here's the thing. Here's one question right off the bat I have for you is what is the difference between reviewing audio and video stuff? Because I know with video they have calibration tools that you can use, and they have like I hear you guys
Right.
talking about 10% windows and stuff like that,
Okay,
like
so
specific things that you can use to say is this TV better than this one? Yeah, how does
that's
that
that's an
compare?
that's an excellent question. It's why I started my channel, which is if you do TV reviews and you rely on what we call the measurements, right? Calibrated measurements like 85% of color volume BT 2020 or 1800 nits, it's completely irrelevant and useless to the actual content you watch. Perfect example. Vizio puts out a TV, 3000 nits, and people are lucky if they're able to get 1800 nits. But then when you put it in real content, it drops even further down. So, what I realized is I have to put real movie content. I have to put movies like Mad Max, Aquaman, The Greatest Showman. I have a list of movies that when you put it on the TVs, all those measurements go away. Uh, Perfect example this year, the Samsung QN98.
Mm,
Ratings 1600 nits peak brightness. The answer is no. You're not going to get 1600 nits peak brightness watching practically any movie out
mm,
there. And we're still, it didn't get as bright as the TCL6 series, which on ratings and many other sites, the peak brightness is lower, but in the same movie, it's actually higher peak brightness. And this has a lot to do with, well, are you going to calibrate the TV? A lot of people don't. They calibrate the TV and suddenly the brightness just drops like a rock
mm.
because it's inaccurate out of the box. But Samsung's response is always, look, we know what you like. We're going to pump up the brightness even if the creator did not intend it to be that bright. And so it's so hard in TVs to just share the numbers because you will not see the images match the numbers at all. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. Well, isn't it one of those things though that you're testing the extremes? So I always like to take it back to cars when it
Hmm.
comes to objective because cars are pretty good. Like you can measure 0 to 60 times. They know
Hmm.
the weight of the car, what's the horsepower and torque, what is the turning radius, how many G forces can it handle during a turn. Now, will most people know? Like, are you taking your car to that limit? No, but
Right.
is it something that you might want to know?
Hmm.
Maybe, especially if you're getting into more high performance stuff, right?
Yep.
So my previous car, I would take it to the track, and so I want to know what the specs are. That's the purpose. That's the reason I bought it, right? I
Right.
want to know should I buy this one or this other one,
Right.
and in my case, I want to know if I'm gonna spin out or if I'm not. So I
Right.
think it's a little different from the average consumer who might not be taking it to those levels, but it's still one of those things where it's useful to know that information.
So this is where I struggle with this a lot because, and I'll give you the example you're talking about, right? The high end sports car in the TV world today is the Sony A90J. This is the winner of the New York City 2021 shootout, the best TV, king of TVs. It has a heatsink OLED, right? It's the first time in the USA and North America that a TV with a heatsink, an OLED, has this ability to go brighter than any other OLED in the USA. But there are only two content scenes where you go, wow, that's awesome. And everything else, it looks very much like the LG G1 or the Sony A80J. That's $2,000 cheaper. So you're paying 1,500 to 1,000 or 2,000 more for that one or two scenes that honestly less than three movies probably have.
Mhm.
But it is a good TV, and you know where you're going to find that scene because we know where it is, and I know what instances where you see that. But then if you watch Netflix, HBO Max, Disney Plus, you'll never see that amazing separation. And this is why this year I recommend the TCL6 series, right? The R646, because like you said, most
Mm,
people when they see that TV, they're like, wait a minute, how this looks just as good as a TV that's twice as much. Because at the very edge,
mm,
maybe that TV will fall apart, but I know where that edge is. Most consumers, they don't even watch that edge. They watch Netflix, HBO Max, over the air. So my reviews, I try to capture what most consumers capture. So when I award an editor's choice, like the TCL6 series, that's why it won, right? It hits everything the other TVs hit that are more expensive for 90% of the consumers. And the last 10%, well, you know who you are. You'll be getting an OLED, maybe the A90J, and paying more. But and that's why I keep on telling you, for me, right?
mm.
The objective measurements are fun for us because I get to design my tests to test those measurements to see if it actually makes a difference. But it's a subjective review that most of my viewers rely on. And it's not just for me. I've been reading a lot of audio publications, right? Stereophile, you name
Mm.
it. And at the end, they just love the opinions of the reviewers, and that influences the decision making, I believe, more than any of the measurements that may be included in the review. So it had me thinking when I reached out to you, Joe,
Mm.
as much as I love the objective measurements, as reviewers, we use it. And if I was a speaker designer, I would use it. But then as a consumer, how useful is it?
Okay. So all right. First of all, we talked last night. We were talking till what, like till midnight, right? And the reason I like talking to you is because you kind of push back, right? I'm very opinionated. I have very strong opinions. I feel like I'm right, right? I feel like I'm right most of the time. And so it's good to hear somebody say, you know what, I don't agree. And that's what I like. So just want to say that right off the bat. Um, I would say to what you just said, you're saying that certain measurements don't matter, right? Or don't, not that they don't matter, but
They don't
they don't
affect
translate
decision.
to
Right,
something that's actually useful, right?
right.
But isn't it that objective measurement is what made you aware that maybe that isn't as relevant? Without that objective measurement, you wouldn't know that it's not as relevant. Maybe it'll let you know that something else is more relevant, right? But in that
So
case, it is useful still.
So you bring up an excellent point. With objective measurements, I know where to test. So Sony A90J, right? I see its objective measurement. I go, okay, this is why it's so good. The other OLEDs don't have this
Mm,
quality. I have content that specifically brings out that quality. And I could put the TVs all next to each other and compare to see, does it really exceed that quality? So I'm kind of testing to verify. But at the end of the day, whether or not the Sony actually meets its promises, yes or no,
mm,
at best for Sony, people buy the TV and feel, you know what, Sony really did it. They this content they win. But let's say at worst,
mm,
it doesn't. Like, man, it looks just like the LG G1 and everything else,
mm.
and so it becomes overpriced. Those with that budget would have bought the Sony anyway, unrelated to picture quality. It's a master series. It's got great audio. It has more wattage out of the speakers. It has, a larger size. It's the only one that's 83 inches. It
Mm.
is subtly brighter than the competition at 83 inches. So my measurements are more of a fun exercise for you guys to go, Sony did it. But if they did not, if it was just slightly better
Mm.
than the competition, I don't know if that would have made a difference, because my test would just have either validated or invalidated their claims, but it would not have affected the consumers buying that TV.
Well, you were saying that Samsung pumps up the colors, right? Well, you would only know that because certain measurements tell you that it is pumped up, right? Because
No,
by itself, you wouldn't.
by itself, you would
By
see it.
itself,
You would see it.
well, wouldn't you know from color calibrations And I'm sticking to video just because it's very easy in video.
Exactly.
It's very easy. When it
Exactly.
comes to audio, it's a little bit harder, but we will get back to
Exactly.
audio. That's the whole point of this.
Right.
But when it comes to a TV, you can see that Samsung pumps up certain colors. That's a measurement. Now, the question is not
Well, no,
is it
no.
a
Let me correct you.
okay.
I don't rely on color measurements when I pull this. So what I do is all my TVs arrive pre-calibrated. So I make sure they're all on the same playing field, right? Now, I do know that if you don't calibrate it, you can see with your eyes the greens and the blues are really pumped up because they want perfect whites, right? They believe that consumers expect to see white on a white, a white screen should be white, not that slight yellow like that's behind me, which is technically what the creator has in mind as slightly off white, right? The D65. So Samsung doesn't care about that. I know that if I turn on the TV from Samsung, it would look what Samsung intended without having to measure anything. And I don't question Samsung. As a matter of fact, I know consumers prefer that.
Yeah.
That's why they sell more TVs than anyone.
Well, I
That's
think
why I'm saying it doesn't matter.
what I'm saying though is that the changes that they've made are measurable. I'm sure they
Yes.
know exactly the changes that they've made in order to deviate from the standard. They know exactly what they're doing.
Right.
And
They
so
do.
that's my whole point is now let's take it back to audio.
Okay.
So in audio, we're talking about personal preference. That's the same thing as a Samsung type of thing, whatever they're doing. Some manufacturers are making speakers based on what they think is more pleasing, right? Based on, I don't know, maybe the owner, right? Who knows? Maybe they tested it with a test group. You don't know how they're arriving at this, but they want to sell as many as possible. Like Samsung, they sell a lot of stuff, but it might be because it sounds better on those, at Best Buy, right? That whatever sound kind of stands out, that's what sells, and that's what they're trying to make. But so that's personal preference. But I would argue that personal preference is also measurable. If you can measure somebody that's hard of hearing and try to get their hearing back to a normal level, then we can measure what somebody's preference is also. I mean, these are all
You
things
know,
that can be measured.
I think you and I had this heated discussion previously
Heated.
about personal. Heated only
All
because
right, let's go.
you convinced me. I asked you, this measure is completely like so off, right?
Uh,
And your response to me was, well, here it is. It's got great bass. It's there's a little bump in the mid bass. This will make it a preference because people like that extra oomph, right? Not
mhm,
like it's inaccurately pumped up, but
yeah.
rather this speaker goes a little bit deeper, a little bit stronger there than similarly sized speakers. And that's exactly what hit me. You're right. Who needs measurements when you bring out two speakers,
Uh,
no measurements, you tell the consumer, look, listen to them both. The one that sounds that little goes a little deeper will
mm.
always be preferred. And it doesn't matter about anything else. And that's what I'm thinking is wait, if consumers, when they bring the speakers home and one just goes a little bit deeper,
Mm.
that one wins.
Usually, yeah. But
Yeah.
that's something that you would want to know, and you want to know how much you want. They can be overdone too, right? There's going to be a point where like, ooh, that's a little too much, and we're finding out that level is higher than what most people would expect,
Right.
especially for normal people. You can bump up
Sure.
the bass a lot,
Right.
and people will like it. But as a company, you would want to know the optimal point. I would want to
Right.
know
Right. Right.
where's
Now,
the point where people
research.
think it's disgusting, right?
Right. Right.
So again, measurements play a role in that you need to know which frequencies. Bass is not just bass, right? There's mid bass. Like there's going to be a certain frequency where you're like, that's a little too high. I don't like that sort of bass.
I think we have to separate the measurements for the company. Like you said, the company needs to know. So I understand that. I completely agree. But for the consumer, I'm pretty certain most consumers don't know where 80 hertz is, 120 hertz. Like if they hear, well, this goes down to 40 hertz,
Yeah,
they have no context what that even means.
yeah,
And it may even be inaccurate. If the specs say it goes down to 40, but plus or minus 6 dB.
yeah,
Like there's a plus or minus 6 dB. What the heck is that?
yeah.
So I would say throw all of that out the window
Mhm.
and either they listen to it themselves. They go, oh, you know what? And of course, in the room will be different, but the reviewer that can say, hey, when I play this song, and just pull out some random rock song, right? Kickstart My Heart, Motley Crue. I can hear the kick drum harder with this one than this one. I think that's more useful to the average consumer than to say, at 75 hertz or the 60 hertz where the kick drum really hits, that hertz part, they just blank out. They're listening for the kick drums, the cymbals, the hi-hat, right? That they know. They have a context to that sound. And I think that's where the subjective part is a lot more powerful than I gave it credit for.
Well, there's a pragmatic way to do things, right? I'm always looking for simple ways to explain something, but it's always based on something objective, right? So the fact that we make it simple and say, hey, you know what, instead of saying, 60 hertz is up by 6 dB, if you say, all right, here's a song where I know the bass is hitting around 60 hertz. Let me play you the song. You notice how it's different from this one versus this other speaker? There you go. That's the difference, right? So that's a matter of simplifying. But it doesn't mean that the measurements themselves, the objective measurements, are not useful, especially for folks like us who are reviewing the products. I think it's very important for us to speak on that level and to know that level.
So you bring up the point that I think this has been ongoing a bit, and I think Denon raised this point. They felt that it was confusing consumers to start posting accurate amplifier numbers because when they post it accurately, they're going against companies that are completely inaccurate. And now they look like a bunch of chumps because they're telling the truth. And the other ones are a bit more, the RMS, right? The amplifier power. So it's like, and then even consumers don't know what they're looking for other than the obvious 5 channels versus 7 channels. That we know. But wow, this amplifier has 200 watts, but then 200 watts, one channel driven. Right?
Well, I think it might come down to marketing or making more powerful amplifiers and using Class D and being able to hit really high numbers and still be very efficient, right?
Throw those out. Just throw all those out. So you're left with really subjective reviews because I think
that's a little different though, because that's a matter of this has been going on for a long time where the amplifier numbers are really exaggerated. And so if they don't have those exaggerated numbers, then they don't sell.
Right.
So there's options though. You can either start using more efficient amplifier designs where you can actually put out extreme amounts of power. And what I would like to see is back to the car stuff. BMW, Mercedes, a lot of times they're known to underrate, right?
Power.
So that might be a new thing that I'm starting to actually see when it comes to what was it? Subwoofers, right? Some of the subwoofers, they're very the F3 or where it starts to roll off the bass frequencies is very important. You want to know how low the sub can hit. And I've noticed a lot of these guys are being more conservative with those numbers. And I'm measuring them lower than they're saying. But I kind of like that, right? So they're saying it can only go down to like 25. And I'm like, dude, this is hitting 16 in my room. I don't know. They're like, we know, but would rather play it safe. I like that game.
Actually, let's stop you there. Instead of saying it goes down to 16, I kind of like what Shane Spare Change does, where he goes, I don't know what it is, but I can feel my hairs like on my hand because it's in the subsonic frequency, right? So he's describing his experience when his subwoofer goes below 18 hertz because now you only feel it. So I think for the average consumer, that part of the review is probably more impactful in their decision making than different reviewers saying, well, my measurement actually goes down to 13, mine goes down to 18, just various numbers. Although I do know the usefulness of the measure, I think the conclusion from the reviewer where he's describing the movie he's watching or she's watching and how it affects them, that I think has more relevance to most consumers. I know the people here are not most consumers, but I'm just trying to be helpful to 90% of the consumers. We're talking about maybe the 1% here who are just totally so attuned to the numbers and the measurements. When they see a measurement, they know exactly what they're looking for. And I don't think most consumers understand that.
Well, I would say that it's not mutually exclusive. You can say 16 hertz. At 16 hertz, it was moving my hear it, right?
Right, right.
But what I don't like is when somebody starts saying, starts spouting out things like, hold on a second, is that based on anything? Or are you just saying fancy words? Because that's where you get into it
Right.
starts getting tricky
Mm-hmm.
because some reviewers, right? No names. I don't need to say any names. If this is how they do reviews, and that's totally cool. And I actually admire some of the work that they do when people are more subjective, and they don't talk about measurements because there's an art form to that too. How do you describe something, right? So even if everything's based on measurements, I've measured it, and then I talk about what my experience is, and I can get that to you if I can relate that and you feel somewhat of the experience that I felt,
Mm-hmm.
then that's an art, right? That's very hard to do
Mm-hmm.
effectively. But I I sometimes worry that these people are too good at that art form and it's not actually reflecting measurements, or it could be something that's trivial like, oh, it's really their experience but in their room, and they don't know well enough to separate their room from the actual experience, so
Mm-hmm.
they might not be communicating the fact that, like, yeah, it has a ton of bass, but I do have the speaker in the corner, and it's actually the room that's adding the bass, not the speaker. When you have it in your room, it's not going to have bass.
Right.
They need to know what's what, right? I think.
So I believe less, and I'm just throwing out a number, who
Yeah.
knows, but less than 5% of the buying population knows or appreciates what we know, which is in certain rooms, the bass response under a certain frequency for that room, right? Every room has their own modes or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But I believe that you're correct. If your room is smaller, you're going to get a lot of bass, especially in a corner. In a larger room, maybe not. But the consumer, they still would want to hear and make the decision based on the reviewer. And we all know you got to bring the speaker home or the equipment home and try it out at home.
Mhm.
And with the way retail is going, with Best Buy will let you have it for 30 days. If you don't like it, return it, whatever reason. That's wonderful. But they have to start somewhere, right? They
Mhm.
can't buy 20 speakers and try them all in their home.
Right.
And so they end up watching the 20 reviews of the speakers they're interested in. And ultimately, because I know one of the commenters, which is, and I used to believe this, which is you have to bring it home because it's different. I think that only applies to the actual bass response.
Mhm.
Above the bass
Oh
response,
yeah.
if a speaker is just too etched up and too sibilant, I think, depending on how you're towing it or not, but still, it's a problem. It'll be a
Yeah.
problem in every room. And the
I know, I
reviewer who
know, I
says,
know. Aaron, right now, as you're saying that, he's probably saying, "Yeah, but directivity also matters." All right, so I
yes,
know
right? No,
that's
we
for you,
know.
Aaron. I got
We
you.
know.
I know you.
But that's the thing is the reviewer. Okay, so let's talk about directivity. The reviewer will say, "Well, this speaker has terrible directivity, but when it's on axis, it sounds great. But when you
Mhm.
take it home, be careful because the minute you walk out, it's going to change. Blah blah blah."
Yeah.
And that's subjective though, because you don't have to include the word directivity at all. You could say exactly that because if you include the directivity plot, the consumer will have
Mhm.
it, but they're not going to look at it because I know exactly what Aaron's saying is it's good to instruct them. Most consumers rely on heuristics, and the heuristic is the minute the reviewer says this is a good speaker,
Yeah.
that's all they hear, and they're just going to move on and make that decision. That's why we have the financial collapse because
Well,
consumers are so into quick decision making without thinking it through.
I don't
And
think
I think
describing something is just subjective. Just the fact that you describe it with words and not numbers, right? If you talk about a math problem using like a words, that's
mhm,
still objective. Just the fact that you say, "Hey, when you walk off axis,"
okay,
if you don't specify
let's
that it's
actually, you're
35
right. Let's
degrees, that's
let's
still an objective
let's reduce it
statement.
even further. This speaker sounds incredible in my room. I've heard
Subjective.
20 speakers. That's all subjective, right?
All right.
How many viewers have you heard say that? But then they add this difference. This speaker sounds incredible in my room
Mhm.
because with this equipment I have, I could turn up the volume and it still sounds clear. I've heard many reviewers who do have measurements. They say, well, you turn it up, it
Mhm.
doesn't distort, it sounds clear. That's mostly subjective, but
Mhm.
it's a conclusion from objective measurements. The distortion, right? You turn it up, It
Yeah.
shows, oh, it doesn't distort at 96 decibels or 102, whatever.
Mhm.
But throughout the word decibel, throughout all of that, I turn it up and my ears are about to explode and I still can't hear distortion.
Mhm.
That most people will call subjective. And I think that's what consumers want to hear to help them decide. Not because they don't care about the numbers so
Yeah.
much as help me decide without confusing me with all these numbers.
Yeah, but the numbers as a reference is always useful because what if it's like that stereotypical old guy like turn that music down,
Hmm.
and it's like man I don't even have this up very loud. Okay, well, what's his level versus youth man who's probably blasting his speakers super loud, right? So I don't know. There has to be a reference level. So if you say 85 dB, now we're talking about the same things. I think that's what's important. That we know that we're talking about the same things, and that's where measurements come in handy.
I completely
Yeah.
agree with you that decibels is a hard measurement, meaning, this is it. Above 95 dB or 90 dB, it starts to distort.
Mhm.
And that's important, but I don't think it's useful for most consumers in terms of when they make a decision to buy a speaker.
Mhm.
I just wonder whether that comes into play at all because speakers that distort at 105 for
Mhm.
THX reference, let's say, right? It distorts, it goes up to 105 dB and then it starts to distort or whatever. But then at 95, it's definitely okay. Most consumers will assume that a speaker is a speaker is a speaker. Does it sound good? Whatever. And I'm trying to see if there is a compromise between too much objective detail that doesn't help them make the decision, and of course, too much subjective that all ends up being this is a great speaker, this is a bad speaker.
Mhm.
Make your choice, right? Like
Yeah.
your ranking. I love your leaderboard.
Yeah.
That's very subjective. But there's no numbers. I
Oh
see,
yeah.
oh, hey, you know what,
Yeah.
Joe? I could afford this one. It's number 3. I'm done. That's it.
Yeah.
That's why I love your leaderboard.
But I specify, right? So I specify this is a subjective. This is just my opinion,
Yep.
right? And so I let
And they're
people.
okay.
I make sure that people are aware, and I don't want to go too into TVs because you get crazy when we start talking about TVs.
Hmm.
But if I say, this OLED's pretty bright, okay, in what situation? Dark room.
Hmm.
So it's always based on context,
Hmm.
like was said in the comment,
Hmm.
that context matters, right? So does it have a lot of bass? Yeah, where? Small room, mid-sized room, big room. So I see real quick. Aaron is saying I think this compartmentalizing objective and subjective unfairly. The two are linked. You start with a relatable term, then you work your way towards an explanation. And so Aaron, if you guys don't already know, has a Klippel near field scanner that does great measurements. Of course, have to know how to use it. So that's what he does on his channel. A lot of objective stuff, but he also we talk a lot about how to integrate objective with subjective. So when I talked to FOMO, I said, look, I think both are very useful, right? I think it just needs to be based on objective. It's not,
What
I
I'm
just don't like subjective
right.
without objective, right? That's when you get into dangerous territory, in my opinion, because then you may start misleading. Maybe things need to correlate with something.
So I found 2 reviews that are not definitely correlative, but
Okay.
actually raises more questions than they resolve. So one of them was in a recent stereophile review. It was an
Mhm.
expensive $20,000 German speaker, right?
Yeah.
And I think they were tower speakers, very nice, or Swiss even.
Mhm.
And so the subjective review, one of the better speakers out there. I mean, all
Mhm.
glowing.
Mhm.
And the objective review. So John Atkinson, at the end of these reviews, he'll take it in, he'll measure it, and he's like, "Man, this is not, these measurements are, there are issues." So here's the problem. In the subjective review, they choose music selections that don't
Mhm.
narrow the issues that are seen in the objective review.
Mhm.
So what Aaron was saying is where they cross over, the subjective reviewer should have talked to John Atkinson, and John Atkinson's, hey, I see these, resonances distortion here. Why don't you choose some songs that have that exact frequency issue so that you can listen to
Mhm.
your reference and these speakers, and now you have something to go by. But then the subjective review was so glowing,
Mhm.
most people will not see John Atkinson's measurements and wouldn't realize that's a shortcoming. Another one is the recent, JBL 4309 at Audio Science Review, which was there was a lot of debate about the actual frequency response measurements. It was a little messy here and there, right? That review. But Amir subjectively said, hey, it still sounds good, as well as many who reviewed the speaker felt that it sounded great, despite the not, well, the issues in the frequency curve. And so I'm thinking, wait, now, doesn't this compel you to say that in this case, a subjective review, ignore the issues raised in the frequency curve? It has great directivity, and then you mentioned that the mid bass is strong. That kind of overcomes the frequency curve. And now we go into the woods. Is a consumer expected to know when to ignore this measurement, which is the most popular measurement on reviews? Is the frequency curve? But now we're looking at directivity, and then okay, everything to the right of the curve at 1,000 hertz. Don't worry about it. It's to the left.
Yeah, it doesn't.
How much bass you got?
So objective measurement. The machine does the objective measurement, right? Now it's up to a human to interpret what that actually means, right? What is relevant, and so that's the part where it becomes subjective, because you have to interpret the data. What at the end of the day, it has to mean something to a human being, right? And I think looking at this, the frequency response looks. If I saw this and I didn't hear, I'd be like, oh, that's kind of wild. This thing doesn't look good. This thing doesn't look good over here. But the directivity, other than this here, looks really smooth, right? So now I can take that as either, hey, maybe I need to rethink how much weight I put on frequency response, and I may need to start looking at the directivity as a indicator of performance.
Now, this as a reviewer or as a consumer?
Well, I think as a reviewer myself, I think that consumers look to us to provide them with good information. And that's where I'm coming from, is I think we're responsible for making sure that we interpret this accurately, right? If they can't, then somebody needs to, right? And so I think that's where I'm coming from, is I need to know this so that I can inform the consumer and maybe not show them this. Maybe I can say it in a different way, right?
And that's the subjective part. So you've already internalized that. We trust reviewers to internalize the objective measurements. So I should be clear. I'm not saying that reviewers shouldn't look at objective measurements. What I'm saying is, for the consumer, they want to hear your subjective impressions, so that after looking at the objective measurements, and then you go into it, and then you tell the consumer, this is a great sounding speaker. Now, they don't care how you got there. They don't care that you looked at the measurements, you struggled with it, because they can't even appreciate what you did to get there. But they wanted to hear you say, either this speaker sounds great, it sounds okay. These are some songs, it didn't sound good. That's still subjective. So if you found some songs where those resonances may have, that cymbal didn't really sound smooth, right? It hurt my ears or whatever. That's what they want to hear. It's like, hey, if you like female voices, this sounds great. But the male voice, it's the classic descriptors. It's too chesty. It's too nasally, right? But how else do you describe subjectively something that objectively people don't know what it means?
Yeah, well, let's just say from the standpoint of a consumer, they're going to watch two reviewers, right? The reviewers are trying to, like I'm saying, I try to simplify what I know from experience, listening, but also the measurements, and then I try to boil it down and present something that is easy to digest. Now, you may have another reviewer who didn't look at any measurements, only based on, maybe they don't believe in measurements, who knows, right? But they're also presenting something that they think is easily digestible, right? Now, what happens when we conflict, right? What if one guy says, this has lots of bass, and I say, no, this doesn't have a lot of bass. Okay, now to the consumer, now they're confused. This guy says there's a lot of bass. This guy says there's not. What I have going for me, well, the measurement also says there's not a lot of bass, so the bass that you're talking about is probably due to your room, which tells me that you probably don't know how to separate your speaker from the room, in which case you should let people know this is how much bass I have because of my room.
Actually, let's go the other way. let's go to sibilance, because I think that's the number one reason why people hate their speakers, because of the
Hmm.
sibilance and the distortion high up.
Yeah.
So, hearing loss.
Hmm.
Both competent reviewers without
Hmm.
an agenda.
Hmm.
One, as you get older, right,
Hmm.
a little hearing loss, so the sibilance doesn't sound sibilant anymore. And then you have a 21-year-old reviewer who's hypersensitive to everything above 10 kilohertz, right?
Hmm.
Same speaker, except the older reviewer is like, wow, this is great. I have it towed in right at me and spot on. And and look at the measurements, but the guy's like, well, it still sounds good to me. So he's, the measurements didn't
Yeah.
comply with my listening experience, so I'm just going to ignore it. And the younger guy is like, okay, do not point it on axis at you. It is pointed away.
Yeah.
And then, but two trustworthy reviewers. So I think a lot of people have the right attitude where you almost have to go with a reviewer, not just that you trust, but it's like you. If I'm an 80-year-old guy looking for speakers, listening to a 21-year-old, I don't think we're going to hear the same thing. Not because he's
Yeah.
not trustworthy, but maybe we're listening to different things.
Well, FOMO, I mean, the other thing is, let's say if I didn't do measurements, I didn't look at measurements or anything like that. As I get older, right, my review, even if it's just me, right, my hearing will change, right? So I don't think you should rely on that at all. And by the way, your hearing is measurable. That's what, when you go to audiologists, they're going to measure your hearing capabilities. And I'm pretty sure they're going to come up with a graph, right, of where your hearing starts to fall off, things like that. So again, measurable, right? And I would love to see what's a frequency response of some of these reviewers, right? And who don't believe in measurements. That's what I'm like, I would love to see.
Hey, maybe we should
Where's,
have a frequency response curve for all the reviewers' ears. Like, there's, as you go up the frequency, the sensitivity drops off.
Mhm.
And then when you lay that over a
Yeah,
frequency
right over.
response
Yeah,
curve,
that's
maybe there
hilarious.
is a correlation between their hearing curve
Yeah,
sensitivity and the frequency response. But it's okay.
yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. But then it gives,
They wouldn't want to do
now,
that.
again,
They're
it's
gonna
more,
feel
more
bad, like,
information, right?
oh.
I
They,
suck.
but let me just kind of give you something that I've told the folks on the Daily HiFi podcast, where I have these earbuds from Monolith, the TWEs, True Wireless Earbuds, right? And by themselves, I think that I don't know if that they're great. They're probably just mediocre, right? But they're using the Sound ID software, which I actually have in for review. Sound ID calibrates those to a flat response first. So even if the drivers themselves aren't perfect, it's going to calibrate them to, a very accurate flat response, neutral, right?
Right.
That's step one. Step two in the process, it's an app on your phone. Step two is it starts detecting your hearing capability, right? So the driver's flat. And then it starts doing tests and it says, oh, you know what? You have a little bit of hearing loss over here. We have to bump this up by this amount so that you hear it flat now, right? So that's step two. That's hearing capability, subjective, part of the subjective part, right? There you go. So Ohm knows. And then third, step three is preference. Now it starts playing tracks. You could, which one do you like better, A or B? This and this one. And so there's three layers to it. Getting the speaker to a flat response, right? And then adjusting for your hearing capability is the next step. And last is your preference. But they're all measurable. So those three overlaid, I think, would give you an idea of what somebody is, how they're reviewing
Okay.
something and what they like, what they don't
So
like.
this
Yeah.
opens a whole new discussion. That's not the topic of this one, but,
Yeah.
and I've spoken with many reviewers, Aaron, Amir, and the like. Wait a minute. If a speaker has good directivity, but whatever frequency curve,
Mhm.
you add DSP, and you ultimately can make every speaker sound good enough with DSP and good directivity.
Mhm.
Wouldn't that kind of solve so many issues? And I think maybe that's why the modern speaker is becoming more DSP based, right?
Yeah.
And so
Correctable.
that takes care of everything. Forget subjective or objective. They all could sound good. And then now they start sharing their curves. For the old man, download the ID function,
For
and
the
then
if you're
boom.
this age or older, this is the target curve for you.
This is my favorite target curve from my age, or too many rock concerts, right? If you've been enough Aerosmith or Guns N' Roses rock concert, you're like, huh?
There it is. Well, I think we've maybe opened up the discussion a little bit more. This is a topic that we see a lot. I know we have to wrap up, but this is a topic we see often, and people are just like, going at each other. And I would just say, look, we have some slight differences in our opinion, and just you can talk it out. It's cool. We're just talking about speakers at the end of the day. We're talking about headphones, talking about TVs. It's all good. You don't need to take it too seriously. I think it's still a learning process, right? A lot of the stuff we're still discovering, like we're still seeing, like, oh, that is more important. But I do believe that measurements, objective measurements, are helping in this process of moving us forward and knowing more about the speakers. It's not magic anymore, right? It's really like, oh, we can look at certain things and deduce certain things, and I think that's very helpful. I'm excited about that.
I think for me, and we are definitely on the same page, is if I love audio sounds review because of all their measurements. And I love what Aaron does, all the measurements. What I try to do is to digest and internalize what do those measurements mean for my speaker making decision, right? My decision to buy a certain speaker. And then as a reviewer, I try to internalize these same measurements and not focus too much on the measurements, because that ends up creating a distraction, arguing over the objective measurements, rather than, look, these are great sounding speakers. I don't know if it'll sound good in your home, but I'll tell you, in my review, blah, 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 it sounds like this. And I think this ends up being the most compelling part, not to downplay the importance of measurements, but how much of it pushes the consumer to buy the right speaker is what I question its value. Not that it isn't important, but I don't know.
I think it's just that because people are looking to us for advice, and they're going to take action based on our advice, I really believe that it should be based on science, on research. You wouldn't go to a doctor and they're, just anybody. You have two guys, right? That are going to give you advice about what to do with your health, right? You don't know who's who, right? You don't know. They're going to give you advice. You have to take action, right? Don't you want to know, like, is that based on, like, did you go to school for this? Or are you just telling me stuff that you read on Facebook, right? That's what I'm talking about. Is like, if you're gonna make a purchasing decision, make sure that it's backed by something. Just because something is presented nicely and easy to digest doesn't mean that it is irrelevant. Doesn't mean any of that. I think what objective folks need to do, I say folks, but more leaning, right? People lean more towards objective. I think what we need to do is make sure that it is entertaining. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. You could say entertaining stuff to describe and then show a graph too.
Sure.
Right? So absolutely. I just think that actually the other thing is that maybe the objective stuff is more suitable for a website where you can sit down and like look at it at your own pace, right? Versus on a video, it's kind of like I'm following the pace of the reviewer, and maybe he skipped over that too fast.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a chance for both. On the review, you talk about your subjective, all subjective, flowery stuff, and then check out the website. That's where I have all the graphs that show what I'm talking about. So
agreed.
Anyway, I know you got to go.
Agreed. No, thank you for having me, Joe. This is so fun. We could be here all day, as someone said. And the last point, though, is, and it applies to all of us. Someone said that you have to trust the reviewer. And I think that ultimately is it. If you trust the reviewer, that is the best heuristic of all, because you share their values and they're consistent in what they say. And so that says, you know what, more often than not, he's probably liking something I'm going to like. And I make my decisions based on that. Like Aaron, he can do no wrong. If he likes a speaker, Aaron, send it my way. I'm not even going to double check.
He's so tough on it that, like, if he likes it, then it's probably good, because he's really hard on him. Exactly. But yeah, man, we'll end this one. We have another one coming up at 12, talking about your area of expertise, video. Right? So 5K budget, UST laser projector versus overhead home theater projector versus 83-inch OLED TV. Oh, it's FOMO time. It's FOMO time.
$5,000 is a lot of money. You want to make the right decision. Let's talk about it.
There you go. See, I told you. You're the only one who used the word heuristic. The only other time I've seen that is for like antivirus, right? Antivirus is the only time I see heuristic scan or something like that. Anyway, it's always good talking. Thank you guys. I'll see you guys who are attendees in the lobby or the various chat rooms. That's it. See you guys in a bit. All right, guys.
Bye.
Take care.